We have a great set of panelists today, and I'll just go along and introduce them. Gary White is the CEO and founder of water.org, one of Time Magazine's top 100 most influential people. We also have David Curia, who is the CEO of EcoTact, also the founder. He's been called a toilet entrepreneur. Laurel Firestone is the co-founder and co-director of the Community Water Center in California. She works on community water issues. Albert Cho is VP of Strategy at Xylem. He has also worked for the State Department and Secretary Clinton's policy staff. And Victor Huang is the CEO of Liquidity, entrepreneur. So thank you all for being here. Water is an important resource. It's also a scarce resource. There are currently millions of people around the world that don't have access to clean, safe drinking water. Gary, maybe you could start things off by giving us an idea of the scale of the problem here.
Sure. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the panel. Hopefully we can do a little bit this morning to kind of help close this health and water gap at both a global level and kind of more local level, especially some communities here in the U.S. I don't think it takes a great leap to get from health to water or vice versa, but just to say, for instance, Hippocrates, the namesake of the Hippocratic Oath, was quoted as saying, "Water contributes much to health." So we have that to stake our claims in. And more recently, in the past few years, The Lancet in the UK basically did a survey of physicians to see what they thought was the greatest kind of health breakthrough ever in history. And it was the understanding and implementation of proper sanitation leading to safe water that physicians came up with. So I think it's pretty safe to say this is a good health issue to tackle today. And then looking at it from a global perspective, there's obviously still a lot of bad news. About 750 million of us on this planet don't have access to improved water supplies, and about 2.5 billion don't have access to sanitation. And I think it's really important to keep those linked together, because improper sanitation is really what's the main driver in water quality around the world. And so we still see, one child dying every 60 seconds from water-related diseases. So we have this immense problem, and in this country, we largely knocked this out about 100 years ago in terms of looking at the bacteriological contamination and improving water. Now, we still have pockets in this country where that is still an issue. I think Laurel will be talking more about that. But it's this massive problem. So that's the bad news. I think the good news is, how do we come up with creative solutions for that? And in some of our pre-conversations with the panel, we're looking at some of the technology issues around this, but also what are the social issues, the political issues, and the financial issues that we're looking to for this. And what we're trying to do at a global level with water.org is help people help them tap into what we think is their intrinsic power as customers and as citizens, rather than seeing themselves as just recipients of charity. And so that's the key thing that we're trying to do, and help people make those decisions about what water and sanitation solutions are best for them. And I think I could give a quick example of that, because sometimes it's hard for people to understand, how do people really poor in developing countries, how can they afford these solutions themselves? And so what we're trying to do is to nudge microfinance towards some of these individuals and families, and so that they can get connected to water utilities, or so that they can construct a toilet, or so they can buy a simple treatment device. And I'll give the example of a woman I met in Bangalore, India, recently. And she was paying 20 rupees a day. The rupees at about 70 or so, 80 to the dollar, so it's not a lot, but 20 rupees a day, so that she could buy water from water vendors who came and sold water in her slum. And she was paying about another 20 rupees a day so her family of 5 could go use the toilet that was there in her slum. And so that adds up to about 1,200 rupees a month if you do the math. It's quite a bit for somebody living in poverty. And so what we did with our water credit program was basically get a microfinance institution to come in and provide a loan to her so that she could then have a water connection right in her home and pay a very small water tariff to the utility, and the utility becomes more sustainable because they're getting a customer. And it was about another loan for her to build a toilet at her home. And so her loan repayments for the next 2 years for that was going to be about 1,200 rupees a month, which was exactly what she was paying before. So there's this huge potential at the base of the pyramid for people to participate in these solutions. And I think that's what we're really trying to do. So now what we've done is we've raised enough philanthropic capital to jumpstart this. And now about 3 million people have received water and sanitation through access to finance, as opposed to a charitable handout. So when we look at those staggering numbers, we can look and see potentially hundreds of millions of people that we can help by coming up with these more innovative solutions, not just around technology, but also around finance. And then finally on that, what we've now been able to do is take this from philanthropy to actually launching an equity fund. So we're standing up a $12 million equity fund. We've almost got that raised. Equity investors in the US can invest in that fund. And then we use that to make loans to our microfinance partners, about 50 of those now, so that they can fund more of these loans for people living in poverty, some of them living on as little as $1.25 a day.
Wow, wow. David, how does this fit with the work that you're doing in Kenya? Tell us about your toilet malls.
Thank you. I come from Nairobi, Kenya, and it's quite exciting, I must say, a journey. When I left the university as an architect, and I had this big ambition of designing malls and airports and auditoriums like this. Until I went to, in my work, when I got the job, I went to the slums of Nairobi. And, you get encountered, and I knew, yes, within the slums, as an architect, will change the landscape. And then you go there inside, flowing sewer, mountains of garbage, 10 years uncollected. And the children are playing all over. And the phenomenon of flying toilets, communities using polythene bags within their house and then just throwing it wherever it will land. And that's the landscape you find there. And I knew for sure that this is an issue of dignity that we need to address. And for the last 10 years, I've been modeling and designing toilets, not malls. And the whole idea here is to really get the context right at the slum level. The biggest challenge I encountered and all the organizations I was linking up with was, are they going to afford if I charge them to pay for the toilets? And for sure, we did the first toilet mall in the slums of Kibera, and we were charging 3 shillings per use, which is really affordable or very low, or $1 per month for the whole family. And guys oversubscribed. And really, to me, that was shocking. From the people we are saying they can't afford. Now, the essence here is that we really needed to capitalize on the dignity level. And we had to do a lot of socio-engineering to get it right. I had to take Miss Kenya to the slums of Nairobi to use the toilet. For the local people to say, yeah, it's not about poverty. This is not the solution for the poor. It's about dignity and standards for all of us. And if Miss Kenya can use it, then they were encouraged to use it. We took the top politicians. The vice president at that time actually used one of the public toilets in the slum. And the whole issue was to re-engineer in the thinking and the transformation at the community level. That way, then, we have been able to scale across the country. We have right now about 75 toilet malls. And these are toilet malls, not just toilet for your, the normal use, for the 2 functions. You go there, you can actually do electronic money transfer. You can get your shoes polished. You can buy your bottle of Coke. And the whole idea was that we needed to generate extra income to be able to leverage the cost of access. And those are some of the innovations that my team, we are working on in water and sanitation, trying to ensure that, yes, we retain the sanitation access and water access to the lowest possible, maintain the highest quality, value in terms of the hygiene standard, the water quality, but still ensure we remain sustainable all across. We can be able to offer maintenance services. We are able to improve in terms of scale. And the whole idea is now linking up that modeling, especially in Kenya, and see how do we scale that. Some of the initiatives that we have partnered with GaryandWater.org is purely to look at how do we retain the water cost low and still make it sustainable with high water quality. Thank you.
And Laurel, these issues don't just exist in developing countries. This is something that's happening here today in the US. Can you talk a little bit about your work in California? I'm particularly interested to hear about how the drought's affecting things.
Yeah, I work with communities and mothers that wake up every day and can't get access to safe drinking water from their tap. They have to worry about how they're going to ensure that their kids have safe water in school, how they can stay hydrated. And that was before the drought. Now in the drought, we have families that don't have water at all in their homes. There's thousands of homes throughout Central California where I work that don't have, whose wells have gone dry, and in some cases have been dry for a year and a half. And that means for a year and a half, families have been having to walk and travel to haul water back to their house for their basic needs, to use showers that are far from their home after working all day in the fields, and worry about how they can get basic sanitation services for their invalid family members. And now with the heat coming on, it was about 104 degrees yesterday in the Central Valley, and pretty much everyone, especially in low-income households, uses evaporative coolers, which rely on water. And so this is affecting all aspects of people's lives and their health. In California in 2012, we passed the Human Right to Water Act, which is the first of its kind in the country, which recognizes that it's a basic human right and that it's the policy of California to ensure that all Californians have a basic amount of safe, clean, affordable drinking water. That doesn't mean free, that means affordable. But that's something that still isn't a reality and is made harder in the drought. On the other hand, the drought presents huge opportunities to really accelerate the kind of change that needs to happen to address some of the underlying causes of why people haven't had safe drinking water for a decade or more in many communities. There's now much more political will and attention on addressing these acute health challenges, and so we've passed a $500 million in water bond funding at the state level to support developing solutions for disadvantaged community drinking water and wastewater needs. We just passed a law that really will facilitate developing more economies of scale and ensuring that communities are looking at ways to consolidate and join together to create larger customer bases and more diversification of their water sources so that there'll be more water security now and for future droughts. And at the Community Water Center, we really work on trying to build community power. We feel like that is the #1 reason why people don't have safe drinking water, and kind of underlying all the factors, whether it's financial or infrastructure or contamination. A lot of that, the places where those are most acutely felt and impacted are in the communities that have the least political and social economic power. And so we do a lot in trying to ensure that communities are part of the decision making that affects them, and really diversify the kind of leadership and governance structures that are creating solutions and making decisions about water access in California.
So, Albert, tell us a little bit about how innovation works here in investments. What can be done to address some of these issues?
Thanks so much. My name is Al Cho. I lead strategy at a company called Xylem, which, in addition to being the name of a plant tissue, also is a water technology company that works all around the world to solve different kinds of water challenges. And in my line of work, I've gotten the opportunity to visit sewage treatment plants all around the world, which is not a hobby that I thought I'd have when I was a kid. And it's really taught me a couple of things. One is that sewage smells the same everywhere. And the second is that people everywhere, no matter how hard they try to pretend otherwise, are all fascinated by what happens to their sewage. So maybe it's part of our common humanity. But sewage is also what I would call one of the world's biggest market failures for all the reasons that Gary was describing. And as we're talking a little bit about solutions, I thought it might be helpful just to start by breaking the problem in half, because the sewage problem and the sanitation problem is really two different challenges. There's one challenge which is really related to access and decoupling, And there's a different challenge, which is about renewal and transformation of existing systems. That first challenge around access and decoupling talks about the people that Gary was just describing, 3 to 4 billion people who don't have access to what we would call adequate sanitation facilities. And the reason that decoupling is so important is that when you think about how much toilets cost, both in terms of capital and water consumption, and you multiply that delta, which is basically 40x or more, by 3 to 4 billion people that you want to include in the world of adequate sanitation, in countries that are both water scarce and capital constrained, you have a big problem. And you can see why it's impossible to replicate the systems we have here in other parts of the world. So that's one big challenge, is trying to include and decouple. The second is around renewal and transformation, because we have a huge amount of infrastructure that sits in the ground in the United States, in Europe, in other parts of the world, which just sits there leaking. It's inefficient, it's wasteful, and frankly, it just destroys a lot of value every single day. And so in order to create a sustainable sanitation model for the rest of the world, you have to transform the way we think about sanitation and sewage, even here. And the reason those two issues are related is that as incomes rise, toilets and sanitation are an aspirational good. People like toilets that flush, and so you're going to see migration from the first bucket to the second. And if we don't deal with the resource waste in that second category, we're going to encounter some even more serious problems with drought and resource sustainability. So that's all bad. By way of kind of thinking about what's good, I think there's some real innovations both in technology, which I think Victor will probably share a little bit more about, but more importantly in business models and mindset that are helping attack both of those problems. And I'll give you a couple of examples of each. When I think about that first challenge, I think the biggest and most exciting shift that has the potential to close the sanitation gap is exactly what we were just describing. It's changing the mindset from toilets being something that are given to people or imposed on them to something that people can choose and people can be empowered around as entrepreneurs and as consumers. So a great example is Unilever, which is a consumer company working with IDEO, which is a design consultancy. They did a lot of great voice of customer work in Ghana. And they asked people, what would be great in terms of dealing with your daily sewage problems? And they came up with a company which now exists called Clean Team Ghana, which goes out and delivers rental toilets that are super clean, odorless, sustainable, and for less cost than it takes to go to a latrine every month, actually comes in, services, and empties that toilet for free, or for a reasonable cost. So that's a great vision. Another is a company that we work with through our charity program called Water for People. They've developed something like a SimCity for toilets that basically lets people design their own low-cost toilet on the internet using their mobile phone, and then download that design so they can pick what they like and then go take that to the local store. So there's some real consumer-driven efforts there. On the other side, our infrastructure is really wasteful. We've done research that shows that 30% of the energy that's consumed in developed country systems could be cut and eliminated at negative cost. It's all pure waste. And that represents billions of dollars of savings that could be used both to replicate systems and also make our systems more financially sustainable. So I'll just close by saying, if you look down in the toilet the next time you go to the bathroom, just think there's gold there. In fact, there's research that shows that a city of 1 million people generates $13 million worth of precious metals in their sewage every year. And so sit there, look down, and think about the value that you're creating. Someone out there is going to capture it, and I think that's going to help the world.
My kids do that all the time. Toilet.
So Victor, you were saying earlier that the problem here isn't so much innovation, it's getting these innovations out there and getting them adopted. Can you explain what it is that's stopping these from being more widely disseminated?
Yeah, why isn't there more innovation
Yeah.
in the water sector? So I started a startup company in Silicon Valley that's bringing to the market new technologies that fundamentally change the way we make filters and membranes. So it's based on over 15 years of R&D, and it allows us to remove pathogens like E. coli and Cryptosporidium and Giardia at very high flow rates. So in 6 to 8 weeks, we're shipping a product that's like a water bottle, and you can go into a river or stream, put on the cap, and drink it instantaneously, and you're getting EPA-grade filtration. So it's been very hard to bring this to market, and it's taken many years. And one of the reasons that we've seen is it's a systemic problem. So innovation is a social process. It's not actually a technological one. There's tons of technological solutions on the shelf. There's countless scientists working on this every day. And so I've done a lot of work with the research laboratories, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health on this work. And you see lots of people working on scientific solutions for water. The hard part is turning that into an organization that can create products that can actually be distributed at scale. And that social process is actually a very complex one because for several reasons. One, you're combining areas of expertise across different disciplines. So you have scientists and business people, investors, engineers, and the users. And usually they don't talk to each other. They're not the people that hang out at parties together. They're very different in personality. There's a lot of social friction between these types of communities. And so just that process alone inhibits the creation of new products. Secondly, there's a problem with the pricing system. So we are not rewarded for saving water, right? There's a lot of water they're giving out here in bottles and things like that. Even in a very conscious group like this one, there's a lot of inefficiency in the way water is distributed. And so if you look at water, it's not unlike the healthcare system where you have the producers, the payers, and the customers in 3 different buckets. And their incentives are always pulling against each other all the time. So the same reason there are market failures in healthcare, there are market failures in water, because they're not penalized for using too much water. I mean, we've got this drought in California, but it wasn't only until a couple months ago where users were penalized for overuse of water. Right? Just ironic, because it's been years where they've been talking about the drought, and they actually haven't put down that pricing pressure on us. So if people are allowed to use a certain amount of water for sustainability, that's great. But when they use more than they need to, they're not having to pay the price. And what that does is, for companies like ours that are trying to push new products into the market, it actually restricts our ability to do that, because we can't actually get rewarded for the risk and the time we're putting into new innovation. And this is not just our company. This is a systemic problem across all types of innovation in the water sector. So how we deal with the ecosystem, the way that all the different pieces interact with each other is really key.
Mm-hmm. Laurel, you were saying earlier about some legislation in California making water sort of a basic human right, but should it also be free? What are sort of the economic theories here, or the underpinnings?
So in California, the law states that it needs to be affordable, not free. And I think everyone knows that that it costs a lot of water to ensure that it's safe and deliver it to people, especially in people's homes. But the key is affordability. And we are, I think, just at the beginning, even in California, at looking at innovative financing structures to ensure that it can be affordable. For example, there isn't in the water sector lifeline rates and the sorts of things that there are in the energy sector, or even telecommunications sector, to ensure that people have a basic amount of safe drinking water that they can afford.
Mm-hmm. And some of the experiences here, Gary, you've had this experience that sometimes just giving things away is counterproductive, right?
Yeah, I think that there's actually this inverse relationship between the level of subsidies that go into water and sanitation programs and the sustainability. So the higher the subsidy goes, the less sustainable they are. I mean, I've been, for a long time, toilets and pit latrines were something that were just given away. And I've been in villages in Latin America where everybody had 3 pit latrines. Wow. And why did they have 3 pit latrines? Because 3 different NGOs were coming along giving away pit latrines. Yeah. And so, they would use one to store tools and one to store grain. And if you're lucky, they were using one to create gold, I guess you could say. So I think that's really counterintuitive in many ways. But to me, it's like understanding the market so that we don't have to be giving things away for free. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the common threads here among most of the panelists is that the technology really isn't the bottleneck. There's kind of this bottleneck around marketing and how do we get the concept of these products to people who need them, and then also the finance to make those things work. Like, where does that lower kind of type of finance come in to fund, initiatives and entrepreneurs that are providing these services? And I think there's been a lot missing there because there hasn't been a lot of bankable deals. So that bottom-up financing to help entrepreneurs and others who really know the market, who are like living, and many of them may be poor themselves, to respond to this. But you also then need to look at the macro capital, and this is a huge problem, right? It would take about $200 billion a year invested every year over the next 5 years to get water and sanitation to everyone and to maintain that. Mm-hmm. The total amount that's flowing in is about $9 billion a year. So there's this huge discrepancy between the problem and its magnitude and the magnitude of the investment. And I think the same is true with the U.S. infrastructure. We're really underinvesting in this. So we have to have more policy issues that drive the investment in that infrastructure for all of us. But then we also need to have those bankable deals on the part of entrepreneurs and others in the developing world so that they can invest in this. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with the equity fund that I mentioned. We want to not just invest in these microfinance institutions so they can make micro loans to poor women to get water and sanitation at the household level. We want to be able to invest in additional enterprises and in utilities so that they can expand the infrastructure to poor neighborhoods, so that these water filters can get out into the market through entrepreneurs and come at this from that capital perspective. And I think that concept, and all kind of going back to seeing the poor as having this intrinsic power as customers and as citizens, and if they can exercise that power, they are going to be the real drivers of this if we can meet them halfway.
David, have you found this to be the case in Kenya? Has it been sort of, instead of looking at these as people who need help, looking at them as sort of consumers who you would like to give them something that they want?
Yeah, I think, and my experience the last 10 years working with the informal settlements across the country is that, to me, they are customers. Only that, again, we have to be very conscious in terms of the pricing, and even without government regulations and all that. Because like last year, I served, per entry, I served about 10 million Kenyans. Now, I wouldn't want to double that, but I'm not going to double that if I increase the price.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of trying to balance the income vis-a-vis the impact, to me, becomes really great, and that's the whole aspect of the social enterprise. Now, the biggest question that comes up is, so we are putting these investments, how are you going to repay in terms of the rate of returns and for most investors? And honestly, I thought that was the biggest handicap in a model that was untested. Until we got a loan from Acumen Fund for about $1 million, and we have been able to pay within 5 years. So it's about that patience also from investors who want to see the difference in terms of putting in the right infrastructure, but also managing that social network and making the ecosystem a bit, level. Yeah.
And just real quick, a couple of caveats, I think, on this is one, that those types of funds like Acumen and that like we're providing, those are what's known as social impact investing, where you do get a financial return, but you also get a social return. And the financial return is muted, right? So our target amount of return on investment or return on equity is only about 2%. So, and it's not risk adjusted. So we have to keep that in mind. And I think that's entirely appropriate. If we can have social impact at that level, that's great. The other caveat I'll put on myself is that, not everyone in the world is going to be able to become a customer and use capital in this way. There are going to be some people who are living in abject poverty, particularly in rural areas, and we can't leave them behind in terms of policies that we and other governments have. But that part of it, if we could serve people as customers, it would free up a tremendous amount of philanthropic capital that could be focused towards those who are in abject poverty.
Victor, what does your experience tell us here?
At its heart, the water problem is a money problem. And that sounds really ironic to people that think of it in terms of delivery issues and technological issues. But the water problem trickles down, no pun intended, all the way down to the user. And so if, for instance, people felt like they could get a market rate of return or better in water investments, you would see the markets open up. You'd see more money go in, because people have talked about water being the next oil for the last 40 years.
Right.
So that's been like a fundamental breakdown in the system. So I'll give you my example. So with our startup company, we got what we felt was the best technology in the world. We got some of the best scientists in the world. We got some of the best business people in the world. And raising capital around this is actually really hard. You can get all the right things aligned, but people, it's not that our deal can't make a lot of money for folks. It's that people look at it and say, the water sector in general is hard to make money, and therefore we're scared from touching water as an entire investment area. So this is the whole sector has kind of been washed with this taint of you can't make money in this sector. And that's been really bad for people trying to do really interesting, innovative stuff.
Mm-hmm. Laura, you talked about fear in a different sort of way, fear among people in communities, that being a barrier sometimes.
Yeah, and I wanted to add here, because in California, certainly money is fundamental, but we actually have the money in California to solve these problems. And when we look at the communities that don't have access to safe drinking water and the estimates of what it would take in terms of funding to solve that, we have that. The problem is that we don't have a lot of the institutional frameworks to be able to deliver that water, and there's a lot of political barriers. So for example, East Porterville, you may have heard of, is one of the ground zeros in the drought. It's thousands of households that don't have water. All have been without water for a year and a half. And literally feet away is the city of Porterville. So they are just out on the outskirts of a city. And that city has safe water. And they have not been able to connect to the city, and even with financing offered from the state. And there's one of the big things that we just did in California was create a new power to really force those negotiations around consolidations to happen. About half of the systems without safe drinking water are in very close physical proximity to existing water systems. And there's real political barriers and sort of prejudices around why people haven't wanted to extend their water out to less fortunate communities, which are their neighbor. And I think we need to really rethink our definitions of communities and our concepts in a much more regional way, and look at how we can all be stronger by creating more regional systems.
Albert, you've done a lot of policy work. Are there lessons that you've learned about how you can bridge some of these gaps, and are there policy approaches to some of these problems?
I think there are. A big part of the challenges Victor had mentioned is a challenge of resources. But the fact is, it's not that there aren't enough resources, it's that they're not always deployed in ways that are efficient or effective or help solve the problem. You know, when I think about, how many of you saw the Bill Gates video, the YouTube video where he was drinking water that had been squeezed out of fecal sludge? Yeah, a lot of people saw that, and one of the things that was so inspiring about that video was the fact that there was this machine that took things that we traditionally think of as disgusting or a waste, and it basically got clean water, energy, and beneficial nutrients for the soil all out of this thing, and basically started to finance itself. And that's the vision. There are resources in what we flush down the toilet every day that we systematically waste. The efficiency of the utility sector is also a big issue in the sense that 20 to 40% of the water that comes out of the treatment plant gets lost before it ever reaches the end consumer. When you start to add up all of the different sources of waste, the amount of energy that we use to try to destroy the value in the wastewater, the amount of water that we lose in the pipes, a lot of money is there. It's just not applied in ways that helps create more value for the water sector. I think the best example of that is water reuse and water recycling. You know, for a long time, people have thought that we had to use the water once and then flush it down the toilet, flush it out of the treatment plant, send it back to the ocean, and then do the whole thing all over again where we clean dirty water and then bring it back into the system. When in fact, it's a lot more efficient and in some cases the best economic option to take the wastewater we're already treating to environmental standards and just take it up a little bit further to the point where it's safe to drink again. And I think that is probably one of the most valuable resources that we can reclaim from our water. And in the world today, I think we recycle less than 4% of the water that we generate through the municipal system. There's real value there to be unlocked, and someone's going to go get it.
Are there some examples of communities that are doing this? Is Las Vegas one, perhaps?
A couple. Internationally, there's some great examples. Singapore gets the majority of its water from non-traditional sources, including water recycling. Israel has done the same for a couple of decades. In the United States, Orange County has direct potable reuse and systems for basically using water in a sustainable way. You're starting to see that migrate across the country. And I think the biggest barrier was always public perception and fear that what was going to come out of the tap wasn't going to be clean enough to drink or to use for beneficial purposes. And that is one area where I think technology, community engagement, education all have to come together to help people break through a barrier that makes a lot of sense to just kind of get past.
Yeah, there is this cultural aspect to it. Laurel, I was hoping that you could get to this idea of sort of, working with communities and people in the community and their fear and maybe misperceptions about water and how it can sometimes lead them to make poor decisions.
Yeah, well, so, we've worked with communities that haven't had safe drinking water from the tap because of contamination for years and fought really hard to get a good source of drinking water that was safe to drink from the tap. But even after that happened, those same leaders that were fighting for that were scared to drink that water from the tap because it had been so long. And there was this real mistrust of and sort of cultural practice of having to also go out and get bottled water. It had been so long that they'd been used to doing that. And so that's something really hard to break, and very understandable. It's something that I think we need to start changing at a young age. There's been a lot more efforts recently to try and ensure that people have access to safe drinking water in schools, that people have workable fountains in schools and drinking water during meal times, both for health and nutrition and hydration, but also to start instilling that practice of drinking water and being able to trust the water from your tap where it is good.
Gary, have you encountered that sort of culture in other places as well?
A bit, but sorry if I digress just a minute, because this paradox is just kind of dawning on me as we look at this, that water, because it is so fundamental, and we've known that obviously forever, and it's become such a part of everybody's day-to-day existence, and this thing necessary to survive, it's been treated specially, right? It's had special treatment throughout the ages and more recently. And so that has created some of these incredible distortions in the market, I think. Because if I look, at the developing world and how water systems really work there, how they really work is there is like this decrepit system that somehow manages to pump out just enough water into the pipes. Most of it, literally most of it, is lost due to leakage and to theft, people just tapping into it. And it's never 24/7. So just imagine this picture. This is the way it really is. Now, what do the middle class and above do to cope? And this is referred to as the coping costs that are in the whole system, which amounts to billions of dollars every year. They buy a water tank, they plant it on their roof, these black tanks. If anybody's been in developing countries and major cities, you look on the roofs, they're everywhere. Every tank has a pump in that house that goes along with it. They pump the water up into the tank and they simulate 24/7 service. They have no incentive to see a system that's any better than that because they've invested all their money into coping with this. And so therefore they're resistant to increasing the water tariff so that you could have a functioning system. And so what's happening is they're getting water less than the price it costs to produce it. They are the ones capturing the subsidies. And the poor, who have to cope with their own coping cost, go to these vendors like I talked about earlier, who are charging 10 times the amount per liter than people who have the system. So you've got this incredibly distorted system where it makes, to your point, Victor, who wants to invest in the water sector when every liter of water that's sold is sold for a price that's less than the cost to produce it? It makes no sense. And so that's really kind of the way things are. And so, I've been doing this for over 2 decades now, ever since I was an undergrad in university. And for me, digesting all of this, over the decades has led me to this point of look at the poor person. What are the things that keep that person from improving their water supply and work outward from that rather than saying they should all have water for free? And how do we work within this distorted market to help them? And I think that's where this whole concept of getting them to become customers in finance, and so they can not pay those water vendors anymore.
So what could be done to realign the incentives? Victor, do you have any ideas on this? Like, how do you fix this problem?
It's fundamentally, it's an issue of trust, right? So people don't trust their water because they can't see what's inside it. So why do we have these things, right, instead of tap water throughout this whole conference? Because we don't trust the tap water. And a lot of it is because there's things inside the tap water, chlorine, fluoride. There's a lot of things that people are now just feeling like, I don't really like that anymore. And they feel like there's long-term health effects. So distrust is endemic within water. And it's especially so in emerging markets. I mean, even in the developed world, just a couple days ago, there was an E. coli scare in bottled water. So like 7-Eleven and Wegmans, and you get about 2,000 boiled water alerts each year in the United States right now. People don't trust their water. Even in Manhattan, when you look across the Manhattan skyline and you see those water tanks on the roofs in Manhattan, people don't realize they're actually drinking from those roof tanks that are never cleaned, right? And there's birds and rats in those roof tanks. So they don't even know the water. Yeah, exactly. So they don't know the water they're drinking, and there's deep distrust when you bring up facts like that. The New York Times has actually researched those roof tanks. People don't know what to do. And then the problem is multiplied many times in the emerging markets. So what do you do? And I think at the very core of it, we need to find ways for people to establish more transparency into the water they're drinking and more trust into the water they're drinking. And Laurel talked about how even when you give them good water, they still don't trust it. So this is, at the very core, if you can set aside the pricing issues, even if you get the pricing right, the distrust, I think, actually causes the expense to happen within the rest of the system.
So some of this may be education that needs to take place, right?
I think part of it too is there are a lot of different problems that have to be solved, and there's not a single answer to that question. And sometimes the solution to the water problem, Gary alluded to this at the beginning, is not really solving water, it's solving poo. And so, to the extent that we have toilet malls, entrepreneurs, new business models like the ones we've seen in Uganda that basically take some of that problem out of the system in ways that are more sustainable than putting it in waterways, then you're actually making a big difference to water and health without dealing with some of the bigger, more complicated, knottier problems of utility regulation and reform. And I think that's really important because simple things like creating small businesses that clean pit latrines and take them to places where they can be disposed of safely, it's decently high gross margin business, very small scale right now, could be grown if there was more financing and capacity development. Those things have a measurable impact on health, water, and sanitation, and they don't require you to work with large, complicated bureaucracies and kind of hope that we're going to solve the issues of trust, financing, and policy.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that there's not going to be one magic bullet here, right? It's going to be a lot of buckshot.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, I think the other sad scenario, particularly when you take your tour to the sub-Saharan Africa, is the link between the needs and the technology. And we all agree that when you talk about water technologies, they're all there, from the high reverse osmosis to the filtration. But what you encounter when you go out there, especially in the rural areas, are these systems, solar pumps that are not functional. They were installed, they worked for 6 months. There's no capacity at the local level to maintain them. And so this is part of the ecosystem that really we need to think when we are trying to sort out some of these solutions. And one of the things we are doing with water.org is to try to build the very basic capacity, not the engineering capacity, but very basic capacity of the water entrepreneur at the local level to be able to handle this. And there are incentives because he's an entrepreneur. He needs to ensure that these systems are learning. So we are putting a package, depending on the technology we are installing, to provide that basic. When do you need to change the filter? Very basic things. Than just going out there and you find very expensive investment, and within 1 year there is no local capacity, even an engineer, an electrician, who can just change 1 or 2 wires and make it work. And I think those are some of the real challenges when you go in remote areas. Huh?
I think that we need to open it up to questions now. We just have a few minutes left, so we'll take some questions right here. Oh, hold on, we need a mic. The microphone.
Hi, I'm Jason Bobian with National Public Radio. All this, you're talking about it from a free market perspective. I wonder what the role of government is in all of this, and that building a sewage system, a sewage treatment plant is a huge investment, or building new pumps. What is the role of government in some of the pictures you guys see of water systems 10 years, 20 years down the road?
Can I?
Sure.
I'll start. Thank you for that question. Part of the point in passing the human right to water law was basically making sure that was at the forefront of the priorities of the state, because entrepreneurship is great, but we see a lot of entrepreneurs locally trying to sell water softeners to local community members who have arsenic in their water, and that's not going to solve their arsenic problem. And so they're really misled into investing some of the little money that they have into something that isn't going to solve their problem. And so I think some government oversight is fundamental. And luckily in the United States, we have a very robust system. In California, we do. That's really important, and I think that's vital for trust. I think if we want people to be able to trust the water coming out of their tap and not have to spend double the amount of money both paying for water out of their tap and having to buy bottled water or new technologies, that we need to have a robust regulatory system at the government level. And then I also think the government's role also needs to be in certain parts of financing and making sure that there is adequate financing for poor and low-income communities, and that the money that's invested is invested in a way that's creating resiliency and not just putting Band-Aids on. So really fostering that kind of consolidation, building economies of scale, not just continuing to drill new wells for a system that can't afford to maintain it, or in an area where there's really rapidly depleting aquifers and increasing levels of contamination.
But did you have something to add?
I think the basic roles of government that you see in some of the markets that we're more familiar with here are ones that are almost universal in nature. The idea of ensuring access, affordability, and quality aren't things that can be surrendered to the private sector entirely, because people want accountability and they do want trust. And one of my concerns about massively decentralized systems is that many governments won't have the capacity to ensure, one, universal access, and two, the quality of the outcomes that are coming through the pipes. And so while there's definitely a role for entrepreneurship to disrupt some of the blockages that have constrained scale-up of investment and services, it's absolutely vital that we continue to invest in the capacity of public sector institutions around the world to ensure access and quality. And I think that's something I would hope people here would agree with.
Another question here.
Thank you very much for a great panel. And whenever I think about water, I see the pictures. What comes to my mind is these pictures of young children in Africa celebrating that they have water. But how do we involve them in creating the solutions, being the next frontiers of innovations in water? Because they're the ones who actually will need water more. How do we involve them? And who among you is doing work involving the next generation? Thank you.
I'll just make a quick pitch for something called the Stockholm Junior International Water Prize. It's something that we fund along with some other partners with the Stockholm International Water Institute. They run national competitions of young people who have come up with interesting innovations in the water and wastewater sector. If they win their national round, they go to a global round. And then each year someone wins a global prize and gets a lot of attention and celebration. It's just one way of kind of bringing innovation from young people into local environments and then trying to kind of create a network of entrepreneurs and young innovators who are going to contribute to that next generation of technologies.
Yeah, I'll just add, we did a project in California in our area where we had local community residents, local water board members, local boards of supervisors, and funding agencies all come together to do a regional planning process around developing solutions on a range of different issues around access to safe water and wastewater. And the kinds of solutions were much more innovative. I think I was looking at, okay, if we're going to replace the pipes because they're all leaking, why don't we look at dual systems so that we're not having to treat the same level, the same volume of water for household uses as we are for landscape or for our schools, fields. And that needs to be happening at very local levels too. And I think one thing that we've been trying to do a lot is ensure that when you're putting in these, in California we have a lot of planning laws and financing to do planning grants and do the environmental review and project design. And part of that scope of work needs to be around community engagement, because you just get much better outcomes and can avoid some of these scenarios where you're continuing to invest money in ways that really aren't affordable and aren't reaching the people that need it.
I can answer this, bridges maybe those last two questions a little bit here. I think it's the top-down kind of infrastructure government and the bottom-up, like somebody living in the area experiencing this, and they both want solutions to the problem. I think water and sanitation services are a natural monopoly, right? You don't want 2 or 3 companies all putting pipes in the ground. So it has to be the government from the top down. And for all the reasons that we talked about and solutions, that has to be more responsive. But this whole concept of the bottom up, I think, if you look at this panel, if you had this panel and constituted it 10 or 15 years ago, you would have somebody from the World Bank, you would have somebody from the UN, you'd have somebody from the EPA, right? There was no concept of social entrepreneurship back then. And so I think what we're seeing is it's not enough to come from the top down, although that has to happen. We need that $200 billion a year being invested. At the same time, we've lost so much human potential by not allowing people to become entrepreneurs and find the funding to do that. It's never been easier to get that seed funding for social entrepreneurial ideas like that to make it happen. And I think that's when we can bridge those two and get more capital out there to them from the bottom up, instead of saying it all has to come from the top down, then we're going to come up with myriad solutions to this, I think.
Just a quick one on the two questions. In terms, particularly in Kenya and the region, when you look at the water investment by the government, it's their main role, to provide the infrastructure. But you'll find that the infrastructure is in the main cities, not the villages and not the small towns, the piping and all that. The reason is water is a very political agenda in Africa. It's the top of platform in every elections. Water, water, water. Now, in terms of the basket of the investment in the rural areas, several governments, like Kenya, has put up the Water Trust Fund. Now, the biggest challenge here, and that's where the donors, it's a real basket of the development partners, bilaterals, and all that. But how do we sort out the issue of corruption in water? That's a key thing. In terms of the next generation, and we are trying in different ways. Last month, we launched a competition with water.org with one of the local universities, mechanical engineers. What is it that we want to get from them? Not the technologies for water filtration. When I went to the Maasai Land where we are implementing the project, the biggest challenge was that the Maasais use donkey carts to ferry water from the source to the households. A lot of contamination, a lot of discrimination. There are no women who can be involved in that business. And what we want the university to do is to come up with, a usable, gender-friendly cart that any lady, young and old, can now take and use the donkey and ferry water in a safe way. So there are ways we are trying to engage the next generation of students and to think about water.
There in the back.
So first of all, I'm delighted this is actually a panel in Spotlight Health, which it's easy to avoid. I think there are two issues here. One is to recognize successes. So, again, 15 years ago, the discussion was not really on sanitation, it was really on provision of clean drinking water. That has largely been solved across most developing countries, at least, and through a fairly simple way, which is just dig a hole in the ground or put a bore well in and get the water out. Wasn't built by, building extensive pipe networks around the place or anything. It was very localized, decentralized solutions, which have, advantages that it gets the water out, but has significant disadvantages when you run out of groundwater or when there's contamination. Sanitation, on the other hand, is also tied to water because, the model that we have of the Western sanitation system, which we have here properly in Aspen, actually requires a huge amount of water. Totally different scale than what is required for the clean drinking water. It requires a lot of water to show up in the toilet and carry the stuff out and take it to the sewage treatment plant. And that's a very energy intensive and a very water intensive enterprise. I think this area is ripe for some sort of disruption because this is just not a implementable or a scalable model in any even second or third tier city that I know of in a developing country, let alone a large one, particularly with the population pressures that they really have. And I'd love to hear what the panel thinks about, what are the ideas out there for building sort of decentralized systems, both in terms of systems as well as in terms of financing, to not replicate the sewage model that exists here, because I just don't see the way in which this can really happen in many other places.
Albert?
I'll say one of the areas for certainly research and development in our company has been looking at some decentralized systems that link either to clusters of buildings or to smaller communities that don't have a way of kind of bringing sewage to a large centralized treatment plant. Because you're absolutely right, when you look at the capital expenditures, water is the most capital intensive utility. It dwarfs electric power and most of it's buried underground, so there's a huge amount of civil works. It's just not a replicable model in many situations. And so I think you will see a lot more R&D and investment going into ways to kind of break that link.
And that's what the Gates Foundation is all over. They've basically set water aside and basically set other things around sanitation aside and said, we're going to focus on reinventing the toilet. And the guardrails around that are that it can't be water-based, waterborne sanitation. So there is effort in that area.
All right, we have time for one more question right there in the back.
Hello, my name is Rok Ursik. I'm coming from Slovenia, Europe, and there has been a lot of discussion in our country about privatization of water supplies. And I would just want to ask you, how do you see this affecting what you are talking about?
I don't know about Slovenia in particular in terms of what's happening there, but I will say I think to this theme that seems to be emerging around the role of government in these systems, I think government traditionally has focused on prescribing solutions and building the solutions themselves. And I think what you're seeing is this shift towards government setting the ground rules for allowing decentralized innovation to emerge, whether it's in private companies or social entrepreneurs or wherever, to solve problems where government actually sets the overall outcomes. So government, instead of prescribing solutions, starts prescribing outcomes. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people in policy positions to do. So I've discovered that they tend to want to solve the problem themselves. They're like, oh, so these people need water. All right, we'll build it. We will build the system. And what happens is the system costs more. It doesn't get maintained. There's all sorts of inefficiencies in the way it's maintained. So I think government cannot abdicate the role of setting the outcomes that they want. So whether it's privatization or whether water is allowed to flow between different actors in the private markets, I think it's important that government prescribes that. But my experience has been that government is pretty disconnected from the private actors in this. Even the regulations in the United States around drinking water are pretty disconnected from the actual innovation that's happening on the ground in drinking water. And I would assume it's just as much a problem in Slovenia, where the people that are setting the rules for the system are disconnected from people trying to solve problems below.
I think 10 years ago, that happened in Kenya. And I think that was really mainly the push of the World Bank and in terms of the commercialization, privatization in Africa. Now, what happened in Kenya was that the government tactically converted itself to the private sector. And that was the essence of private sector. So it remained purely, the water supply in Kenya is purely owned by government, but through a pseudo company, and that was really how far they accepted to move toward privatization. Now, what we are arguing in Kenya, and that some of us are already in the debate with government, is that let's see the benefits of privatization vis-a-vis getting access and improving access. And I think one of the success models is the telecommunication across Africa. 20 years ago, it was purely government. It was only one line. And today, it has created a lot of innovation, the M-Pesa systems in Africa and in Kenya. It opens up scope for innovation and the private, really, to pump in private capital into the system. What I see the role of the governments in future is to maintain some control in terms of tariffs, particularly for the poor, the water quality monitoring, so that we all get quality water.
And this was a
I'm
real,
afraid we're going to have to end it there. I'm seeing that we're out of time. So thank you all for coming, and thanks for our wonderful panelists.